The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song as Katie Morrison pushed through the Cedar Creek Medical emergency room doors at 6:22 a.m., her badge clipped to scrubs the color of seafoam. Rain hammered the parking lot behind her, but she moved through it like it wasn't there, her shoulders squared, her stride efficient. 32 seconds from the ambulance bay to the nurse's station. She'd timed the route her first week. Muscle memory made the distance disappear. The ER was already breathing hard. A multi-trauma from IA-37 lay in Bay 3, his left leg wrapped in a tourniquet that had held pressure for 53 minutes. A woman with a possible MI clung to the monitors in Bay 1, her heart rate climbing like a frightened thing. And in Bay 2, a combative overdose patient thrashed against soft restraints, his pupils blown wide, his language a string of profanities that seemed to energize rather than settle him. Katie moved past the chaos without looking at it directly, the way a soldier learns to process a battlefield without targeting any single threat. She pulled the chart for Bay 3 and read the intake in 4 seconds flat. GSW to the left femoral. Progressive blood loss. Tourniquet hemorrhage control appropriate. Force 2 and 18 gauge. Fluids running wide open. Vital stable for now, which meant unstable in 90 seconds if nobody caught the slow bleed happening under the bandaging. She was reaching for the trauma pack when she saw the notation on the post-op orders. Fentanyl 2 micrograms per kilogram for the post-operative pain management on the septic patient in Bay 5. The dosage made her spine straighten. A 98-kilogram male on that dose was overdose territory, the kind of calculation that looked clean on paper but turned a recovery into a code blue. Dr. Philip Mercer stood at the prescription station, his white coat pristine, his posture the careful arrangement of a man who'd spent 3 decades learning how to occupy space like it owed him deference. His watch caught the fluorescent light as he signed off on the order, a Rolex, expensive enough to fund a used car. Katie approached the station and pulled the chart, her voice quiet as rain. Dr. Mercer, the fentanyl dose on the septic patient. He turned slowly, the kind of turn that suggested she'd interrupted something important. His eyes moved across her face without quite landing on it, the way you might glance at a door or a wall. The post-op protocol is established. The dose assumes normal hepatic clearance. She kept her voice level, flat, the way she'd been trained to brief intelligence reports. Clinical. Factual. No inflection that might suggest she was correcting anything. His liver function tests came back elevated. The dose would be 1.6 micrograms per kilogram maximum. What's written is 2.1. For a moment he didn't move. The ER sounds continued around them, the beeping of monitors, the creak of stretcher wheels, the distant wail of an ambulance arriving. Then his jaw tightened, a small muscle working at the corner of his mouth. He looked at the order again, and Katie watched the moment he understood. The error was his. The correction was hers. A nurse's. "I'll adjust it," he said, his voice smooth as ice over a frozen lake. Not gratitude. Not acknowledgement. Just a statement of fact, delivered to the space above her head rather than to her directly. Katie nodded once and moved toward Bay 2. The combative patient was still thrashing, his restraints creaking with the force of his movement. His skin was gray-white, his breathing shallow, his eyes rolling. Opioid overdose, untreated, the kind of crisis that turned violent when the body realized it was drowning in its own chemistry. The resident on the case stood at the foot of the bed, his arms crossed, his expression the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to get too close to patients who might spit or swing. Katie approached the bedside and moved her hands visible, open, the universal signal of non-threat. She'd done this before. Once in Ramadi at a checkpoint where the interpreter was seizing and the guards thought he was insurgent, and once in a stateside training facility with a Navy SEAL on too much fentanyl and not enough sense. The language was different, but the mechanics were the same. You moved slow. You breathed slow. You made your body smaller. "Hey. Hey, I see you," she said, her voice dropping into a register that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her chest. "You're in a hospital. Cedar Creek Medical in San Antonio. You're safe now." The patient's eyes locked onto hers for just a moment, the kind of fleeting connection that happened when someone's nervous system was so flooded with opioids that survival instinct was all that remained. She reached for the foresight on his left arm, her movements precise, economical. The catheter was still viable, the vein intact. She ran warm saline through the line and established flow, her hands moving like they'd done this 1,000 times before, which they had, though not in this way, not in this uniform. "We're going to get you stable," she continued, still in that low voice, still moving slow. "Your body's in shock. That's the panic you feel. It's not dangerous. It's your nervous system rebooting." The resident watched from the foot of the bed, his arms still crossed. He was probably wondering why the nurse was doing the talking. Probably wondering why the patient's breathing was already starting to stabilize, why the rage was draining from his face. Probably wondering why her hands moved like she'd trained on this, like she'd read the body's language in a dialect most people never learned. Mercer had appeared in the doorway. Katie felt his presence before she saw him, the way you feel someone's attention, the way you feel heat from a fire. She didn't acknowledge him. She finished checking the foresight, confirmed the line was patent, and made a note on the chart without looking up. The patient's oxygen saturation was at 87%. She adjusted the flow on the nasal cannula to 4 liters and watched the monitor climb. 91. 93. Stable. Only then did she turn away from the bed. Mercer was still standing in the doorway, his white coat against the beige walls, his expression the careful arrangement of a man processing something his hierarchy didn't accommodate. She moved past him toward the supply station, her shoulder not quite touching his as she passed. Behind her, she heard him return to the nurse's station, his footsteps sharp on the linoleum. What Katie didn't register was the moment his mind made a decision. She didn't see him pull out his phone and open the notes application. She didn't see him type, "Patient in Bay 2, RN Morrison overstepping with verbal sedation protocol. Nursing assessment should remain within scope. Potential protocol violation." She didn't see him at the timestamp, 6:52 a.m. She was already moving into Bay 3, already assessing the tourniquet site, already calculating blood loss based on the saturation of the dressings. The rain continued hammering the windows. The monitors continued their beeping. The hospital continued its breathing, its constant rhythm of crisis and recovery, emergency and routine. What Katie Morrison did see, without turning around to look, was the beginning of something that would take months to unfold. Mercer had seen her hands move with precision, had watched her calm a patient with her voice alone, had observed the way she'd caught a dosage error that would have killed someone. And in that observation, in that moment of witness incompetence he couldn't dismiss, something in him had hardened into purpose. He'd spent 34 years climbing a hierarchy that was supposed to be absolute. He wasn't about to let a nurse with scarred hands and a military bearing remind him, or anyone else, that expertise didn't require a medical degree or a white coat. By the time Katie was stabilizing the multi-trauma patient in Bay 3, Mercer was already at his desk on the 3rd floor, his private files open, a new folder created and labeled with her name. The first entry was timestamped 6:52 a.m. By lunchtime, there would be 3 more. By the end of the week, there would be 7. And none of them would mention that a nurse with captain-level competence had just saved a patient from a dosage that would have stopped his heart before his next breath. The folded flag in Katie's locker on the 4th floor bore the name of Marcus Chen, embroidered in small letters on the corner. SSGT, Marcus Chen, KIA Ramadi 2009. She kept it there because Marines kept things that mattered close, even when they were supposed to be civilians now, even when they were supposed to be nurses, even when the work they were actually doing had nothing to do with chest tubes and 4 lines and everything to do with watching a hospital administrator move fentanyl through supply chains that shouldn't have existed. Mercer was building a file. Katie was building a case. And neither of them knew yet that the next person to walk through Cedar Creek Medical's doors would change everything. The conference room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness that comes from recirculated air and 12 people breathing the same filtered oxygen for 40 minutes. 23 residents stood in tiered rows, their white coats pressed, their eyes fixed on the projection screen where Katie Morrison's patient chart blazed in clinical detail, vital signs, nursing notes, medication reconciliation, all of it rendered in the harshest possible light. Dr. Philip Mercer stood at the podium with a red marker in his hand like a prosecutor presenting evidence of a crime. His presence had a weight to it, the kind that made the air pressure change in a room, the kind that came from 40 years of accumulated authority and the absolute certainty that he belonged at the center of every space he occupied. He circled something on the transparency, Katie's handwriting, her clinical observations, her recommendations, and turned to face the residents with the expression of a man about to deliver a teaching moment they would remember. "Let's discuss a concerning trend," he began, his voice carrying that professorial tone that turned statements into commandments. "Nurse Morrison here documented what she calls clinical observations on Mr. Alvarez's sepsis case. Decreased urine output. Rising lactate." And then, he paused, letting the moment hang like a sword suspended by a thread. She suggested a vasopressor adjustment. Katie stood at the back wall of the conference room, her posture upright but not rigid, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Her hands held her clipboard with a grip tight enough that her knuckles had begun to blanch, a small betrayal of composure that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before she redistributed the tension down her forearms. She'd learned this trick in field medicine. You couldn't control what your face did, but you could control where you held your stress. Move it down, move it out, keep it invisible. "This is called overstepping your scope," Mercer continued, his marker moving in deliberate circles across the projected image. "Nurses, listen carefully. You are not diagnosticians. You are not physicians. When you think you see something, you report it. You document it. You do not interpret. You do not suggest treatment modifications. That is the definition of practicing medicine without a license, and it is both dangerous and illegal." One of the younger residents, a PGY2 who couldn't have been more than 27, jotted notes furiously, absorbing the lesson like doctrine. Katie recognized the look. She'd seen it in soldiers too, that hunger to please authority, to absorb the rules so thoroughly that they became invisible, so intrinsic that you stopped questioning them. "This is how patients die, ladies and gentlemen," Mercer said, his voice dropping to a register that made everyone lean in slightly. "This is how hospitals get sued. This is how institutional trust erodes. When nurses decide they're better diagnosticians than physicians, when they contradict medical judgment based on hunches or patterns they think they've observed, people die." He turned and looked directly at Katie, and for a moment his eyes held something that looked almost like pity. "Nurse Morrison, in the future, stay in your lane. Are we clear?" Katie met his gaze without flinching, without the slightest acceleration of her breathing. "Crystal clear, Dr. Mercer," she said quietly. The room exhaled. The residents returned their attention to their notes. Mercer smiled, a thin expression that didn't involve his eyes, and moved on to the next case study. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, Katie found herself in the break room at 2:17 in the morning, feeding crumpled dollar bills into the vending machine. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their endless mechanical song. The machine dispensed a paper cup of something that vaguely resembled coffee, still steaming, still hot enough to carry the smell of burnt grounds and the faint chemical aftertaste of the heating element. She was reaching for the cup when the door opened behind her. Dr. Mercer entered with Dr. Sandra Patel, the chief of medicine, a woman whose competence was beyond question but whose loyalty to institutional hierarchy was even more unquestionable. They were mid-conversation, their voices carrying with the ease of people who assumed no one was listening. "The problem with some of our nursing staff," Mercer was saying, feeding coins into the vending machine next to Katie's, "is that they've been exposed to medical knowledge in a clinical setting long enough to develop what I'd call a false sense of expertise. It's Dunning-Kruger effect, Sandra. Classic case. They don't know what they don't know. They watch television shows about hospitals, they spend enough time around physicians, and suddenly they believe they have the clinical judgment that takes us decades to develop." Katie's jaw clenched, once, a microsecond of visible tension that ran through her masseter muscle like an electrical current. She felt it happen, felt the involuntary response, and deliberately unclenched before it could register as more than a micro-expression. She turned toward the vending machine and retrieved her coffee without making a sound. "It's actually a safety issue," Patel said, her voice carrying the weight of concern that sounded almost genuine. "Did you hear what happened in Trauma Bay 3 yesterday?" Katie was already moving toward the door. She didn't wait to hear what had happened in Trauma Bay 3 yesterday. She already knew. Because it was her. It was always her. The break room door swung shut behind her with a pneumatic hiss. By the following week, Katie's hands had developed a tremor that appeared only during the hours between midnight and dawn, a small vibration that made it difficult to draw medications from vials without pressing the needle against the rubber stopper 3 or 4 times before achieving a steady enough hand to extract the fluid. She'd stopped sleeping more than 45 minutes at a stretch. Her brain, trained to operate under threat, had begun to interpret the hospital itself as hostile territory, fluorescent lights instead of muzzle flashes, but the hypervigilance was identical. The anticipation was identical. During a shift on a Wednesday, she found herself standing at the medication dispensary station when Dr. Mercer appeared at her elbow with the sudden presence of someone who'd learned how to move through spaces without announcing himself. "Morrison, a word," he said quietly, and the tone itself was a kind of violence, not raised, not threatening, just the sound of absolute authority exercising itself. Katie turned to face him, her chart still in her hands. He leaned close enough that she could smell the cologne he wore, something expensive and overwhelmingly floral, something that suggested he'd never once worried that the space around his body belonged to anyone but him. "I've noticed you have a habit of finding problems with physician orders," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "That suggests one of two things. Either we have a critical competence crisis among our entire medical staff, which, I assure you, we don't, or you have a superiority complex. A belief that you're smarter than physicians. A belief that you should be directing treatment in this hospital." Katie's face remained absolutely still. She was breathing through her nose, controlled, methodical. "I'm filing an observation report with the nursing director about your pattern of behavior," he continued. "Flagging your tendency to countermand physician judgment. One more incident, one more time you suggest that a physician has made an error, one more time you step outside your scope, and you'll be escorted out by security. I have documentation. I have witnesses. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, Dr. Mercer," Katie said. He held her gaze for another moment, long enough for her to understand that this wasn't casual harassment. This was strategic. This was calculated. This was a man who'd identified a threat and decided to systematize its removal. Then he walked away. Katie returned to her charting. She pulled a pen from her pocket, a basic ballpoint with a Cedar Creek Medical logo, nothing distinctive, and continued documenting medication administration on Mr. Harrison's chart. Her handwriting was steady. Her notes were clinical, precise, utterly unremarkable. The pen moved across the paper without a tremor because she'd learned long ago that you could compartmentalize anything if you understood that survival was the only acceptable outcome. Around 3:45 a.m., during a brief lull between admissions, she stood in the supply closet and pressed her palm against the cold metal shelving, focusing on the sensation of the steel's rigidity, the way it transmitted no give, no mercy, no flexibility whatsoever. That wasn't the worst part either. But that wasn't the worst part either. Because somewhere in the trajectory of his documentation, Dr. Mercer had begun to move beyond social humiliation into something more institutional. The incident reports were accumulating, 3 by the end of that week, each one meticulously typed, each one citing specific times and dates and alleged violations of scope of practice. He'd begun the process of creating a paper trail that would eventually justify her removal. He'd begun systematizing her destruction with the precision of someone who'd learned that institutions protect those who understand their mechanics. Then, on a Thursday evening at 6:14 p.m., the emergency room doors burst open and everything changed. A figure appeared in the waiting room entrance, a man, massive, at least 6'5", with a kind of bulk that came from decades of physical labor or combat or both. His shirt was soaked through with blood. His eyes had that particular quality of wildness that comes from a brain operating at extreme stress, from a nervous system flooded with adrenaline and cortisol and the chemical signature of acute trauma. In his right hand, he swung a tire iron. The waiting room erupted. Visitors scrambled for exits. A father pulled his daughter behind a chair. An elderly woman pressed herself against the wall. The security guard reached for his radio but kept his distance, his hand moving with the careful caution of someone who'd been trained that distance was survival. Katie Morrison was documenting lab values at the nurse's station when the code was called. She heard the screaming first, then the crash of something heavy hitting the vinyl seating. She stood up, her chart still in her hands, and walked directly toward the sound. The waiting room doors swung open under her momentum. The man with the tire iron was swinging it now with increasingly wild arcs, his mouth moving, his breathing ragged. The words coming out of his mouth were in Pashto, a rapid-fire cascade of curses and prayers and sounds that contained the specific acoustic signature of battlefield hysteria. Katie saw his hands. She saw the tremor in them. She saw the expression in his eyes, not aggression, but desperation. Not violence, but panic. She walked directly toward him with her hands visible, her palms open, her posture low and non-threatening. "Enough," she said in Pashto, her voice dropping into a register that carried command authority. "Put down the iron. You're safe now." The man's eyes found her. His mouth opened. The tire iron lowered fractionally. "Basira Aldebiba," he whispered, and the name, the wolf, the insightful she-wolf, her call sign from Ramadi, the name that belonged to a woman who no longer officially existed, hung in the waiting room air like a physical presence. The code blue alarm shrieked from Bay 4 like an animal caught in a trap. Katie was 3 floors up, charting vitals on the second-floor MedSurg unit, when the overhead intercom crackled, "Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. She didn't hesitate. She moved. Stairs were faster than the elevator. Her legs remembered the muscle memory of sprinting toward incoming rotations in Ramadi, when the alarm meant someone had minutes, maybe seconds, before the decision between life and death became academic. The trauma bay doors slid open and the noise hit her first, the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, the monitor's frantic beeping, the rapid-fire shouts of nurses calling out vitals. Oxygen sat dropping. 86. 82. 78. A man lay convulsing on the gurney, his body arching and twisting, every muscle tight as a coiled spring. The VA hospital bracelet on his wrist read, "Joseph Kern, age 54, Army Infantry." His eyes rolled back. Blood trickled from where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek. Dr. Amy Chen stood frozen 3 feet from the bed, her hand shaking as she reached for the crash cart, then pulled it back, then reached again. "We need to wait for Dr. Mercer," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the alarms. "He's in surgery. He'll be here in 20 minutes. Katie didn't respond. She moved into the space beside the bed, her eyes scanning the monitor display, the patient's color, the angle of his head. His lips had turned a dusky blue-gray. His neck veins bulged against his skin like ropes about to snap. The left side of his chest barely moved with each breath the ventilator pushed into him. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis assembled itself in her mind before her conscious thought caught up. Air trapped in the pleural space, compressing the lung, pushing the heart sideways, suffocating him from the inside. 90 seconds. Maybe less. His blood pressure was already dropping, 110 systolic, 105, 98. The numbers were a countdown. Katie reached for the supply cart. Her hands moved on their own, the way they had in Ramadi when the clinic in the green zone had taken mortar fire and she'd needed to triage 3 wounded before the next volley came in. There was no time for hesitation. There was no time for protocol. 14-gauge angiocath needle. She tore open the betadine packet with her teeth, swabbed the point where the second rib met the clavicle on his left side, the midclavicular line. The needle glinted under the fluorescent lights. "Katie, stop," Dr. Chen started, but the needle was already moving. The plastic catheter slipped through the skin, through the muscle fascia, into the pleural space. The sound was thin, subtle, almost musical, a small hiss of air escaping, like letting pressure out of a balloon. The rush of compressed air escaped in a whisper. Joseph Kern's body went rigid for one moment, then still. His oxygen saturation climbed. 88. 92. 96. His eyes opened. They were the color of old steel, and they tracked her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Not the unfocused panic of a man still in crisis, but the sharp, aware recognition of someone who had seen something he thought he'd never see again. His lips moved. Her name came out as barely a breath, barely a sound, a word that belonged to a woman who was supposed to be dead, who had been left behind in a desert 7,000 miles away. Basira Aldabiba. The wolf. The insightful she-wolf. Her call sign. The name her squad had given her when she'd negotiated a ceasefire at a Ramadi checkpoint using only her voice and the weight of a captain's authority, when she'd talked down insurgents who would have killed anyone else in that moment. The name that had disappeared when she'd left Ramadi. The name that was supposed to stay buried. Katie's hand was still on the catheter. She didn't pull it away. She didn't move. Her face remained utterly neutral, but her mind was running calculations, how much he'd seen, how much he remembered, whether his recognition was real or the confused memory of a man who'd just been dying and was maybe still half hallucinating in oxygen-deprived delirium. Stable, she said quietly. The word was for Dr. Chen, for the nurses, for the monitor. The word was also for him. It meant more than oxygen saturation and heart rate. It meant hold your silence. It meant I know who you are. It meant we both understand what stays in this room. Joseph Kern's eyes closed. His breathing remained steady. The ventilator hummed its mechanical rhythm, pushing air in and out of his healing lungs. The monitor showed what it was supposed to show, oxygen climbing. Sinus rhythm. A man pulled back from the edge. 10 feet away, on another gurney, an older man sat up despite the fall line in his arm, despite the bandages on his left shoulder. His name was Sergeant Frank Dawson, admitted 6 hours ago with a knife wound from a domestic dispute he wasn't being very cooperative about describing. His eyes locked onto Katie. She watched recognition bloom across his face, the kind of recognition that soldiers carry when they see someone else with the same invisible weight in their shoulders. I knew it, he breathed. His voice was rough, textured like gravel under boots. I've seen that procedure done exactly once, in Kandahar, by a Green Beret medic. And she moved exactly like that, like the air wasn't real anymore, like her hands were thinking faster than the rest of her body could keep up with. That's not standard nursing. Katie didn't look at him. She was documenting vitals, her handwriting steady and precise, pneumothorax, decompression attempted, oxygen response adequate, patient stabilizing. Each word was true. Each word was also a firewall. The defense intelligence operation that had brought her to Cedar Creek Medical 6 months ago couldn't survive scrutiny. One more layer of exposure, one more person who recognized her, and the entire mission collapsed. The administrator she was here to monitor, suspected of running cartel product through the hospital's controlled substance vault, would get tipped off. 2 years of surveillance work would evaporate. The evidence would disappear. The trauma bay doors slid open. Dr. Philip Mercer stood in the threshold in surgical scrubs, his mask still dangling around his neck. His eyes took in the scene in one sweep, the catheter in Kern's chest, Katie's gloved hands, Dr. Chen standing frozen like she'd been caught doing something wrong. His gaze settled on the needle, then on Katie's face. The blood drained from his cheeks. Not with relief. With something colder than that. What, he said, and his voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that made the air pressure in the room change, did you just do? Katie met his gaze. She set down the documentation clipboard with the kind of deliberation usually reserved for laying down weapons. Her voice was steady, measured, the voice of someone explaining a simple fact. Tension pneumothorax. Lung collapsed. He would have coded in 90 seconds. Mercer's face flushed red, not the color of shame or embarrassment, but the color of a man who had just been publicly contradicted by someone he'd been systematically working to destroy. His hands clenched at his sides. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, his movements sharp, aggressive, the way someone moves when they've made a decision they're not going to walk back. "You performed a procedure reserved exclusively for physicians," he said, typing rapidly. "Under state law. Under hospital bylaws. You performed a procedure without a license." Dr. Chen was present. Multiple witnesses. He looked up from his phone, and his eyes had the gleam of something predatory that had finally cornered its prey. "I'm documenting this. A formal complaint to the State Nursing Board. To Hospital Administration. To the Medical Licensing Board. Every violation. Every time you've overstepped. Every time you've acted like you have a degree you don't have." He hit send. Katie heard the notification ping of his email delivering to inboxes across the hospital network. "You're done, Morrison," Mercer said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of someone who'd just pulled a trigger he'd been aiming carefully for 3 months. "This is the evidence I needed. This ends your career." He turned and walked out of the trauma bay, his surgical clogs making soft whispering sounds against the tile floor. Katie didn't move. Behind her, Joseph Kern's oxygen saturation remained at 98%. Sergeant Dawson was still watching her from his gurney, his expression unreadable. Dr. Chen had finally found her voice, but whatever she was about to say died before it reached her lips. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed. And Katie Morrison stood absolutely still, understanding that the operation had just become infinitely more complicated, and that the only way out now was through. 2 hours after stabilization, Joseph Kern's monitor began its descent into crisis. The beeping accelerated from steady rhythm into staccato panic. Katie was charting at the nurse's station when the alarm split the air like a blade, and she moved before her conscious mind caught up with her hands. The oxygen saturation line on his screen plummeted, 94, 89, 73. The number dropped the way aircraft altitude drops during catastrophic failure. She was in the bay in 8 seconds flat. The on-call resident, Dr. Marcus Webb, no relation to her handler, a coincidence that had always felt like a cosmic joke, stood frozen beside the ventilator, his jaw slack as he stared at the monitor displaying Kern's trachea deviation. The windpipe was shifting visibly to the right, millimeter by millimeter, compressed by mounting air pressure inside the thoracic cavity. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. The kind of complication that killed patients in the time it took most people to understand what was happening. 60 seconds to cardiac collapse, Katie said. Not a question. Not a request. Dr. Webb's mouth opened. Closed. He looked at the resident, then back at Kern, his hands trembling like a field mouse caught in an owl's shadow. Katie didn't wait. She moved to the supply tray with the fluid precision of someone whose hands had performed these movements under mortar fire. The 14-gauge angiocath needle caught the fluorescent light as she prepped it, her movements economical, certain. No hesitation. No second-guessing. Second-guessing was for doctors who'd never seen what happened when hesitation meant someone's lungs collapsed inside their rib cage. She palpated the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, found the landmark with her fingers, positioned the needle. 80 millimeters mercury of pressure, best estimate. Acute decompensation. Not a diagnosis. A statement of fact. The kind of fact you delivered when someone's life had maybe 40 seconds remaining in it. The needle went in. The hiss of pressurized air escaping sounded like a sigh of relief from the patient's own body. 35 seconds of work, no more. The oxygen saturation climbed immediately. 91. 95. 100. Kern's chest stopped heaving. The monitor normalized into steady rhythm, and the entire bay seemed to exhale with him. Dr. Webb stared at her, his face the color of bleached bone. You just performed. A needle decompression, Katie said. She was already disposing of the needle, her voice flat as a river with no current. He was in full arrest. Another 30 seconds and he'd have coded. She didn't look at Dr. Webb. She didn't need to. She already knew what she'd see in his face, the dawning realization that he'd frozen while a nurse had saved a man's life with a procedure he wasn't sure how to execute. Dr. Mercer appeared in the bay doorway 47 minutes later. Not through any legitimate clinical reason. Just appeared, as though he'd been summoned by some institutional gravity that bent light toward his presence. He took in the scene, Kern stabilized, sedated, the bay clean and organized, and Katie saw the calculation happen behind his eyes. Saw the moment he understood that Joseph Kern was alive, and that Katie Morrison had made that happen, and that this was the perfect casus belli for the bureaucratic war he'd already begun. 3 hours later, the first incident report was filed. Then another. Then another. Over the next 21 days, Dr. Mercer submitted 14 separate documents, each one stamped and notarized like a legal assault weapon. The precision was almost beautiful in its cruelty. He didn't rage. He didn't accuse her to her face. He simply documented. The report cited the Joint Commission standards for nursing practice. They invoked hospital bylaws. They quoted State Nursing Practice Acts verbatim, with specific subsections highlighted. Practicing medicine without a license, the reports concluded. Independent clinical decision-making without physician oversight. Failure to defer to medical hierarchy. Each document was copied to the CEO, the Chief Nursing Officer, Risk Management, and Legal. Dr. Mercer was building something architectural, not a complaint, but a fortress of evidence constructed from her own competence against her. Katie read them all. She didn't defend herself because she couldn't defend herself. Not fully. Her presence at Cedar Creek wasn't about becoming a better nurse. It was about Vincent Cross, the hospital administrator who'd been diverting controlled substances through a pharmacy account that shouldn't exist, moving them south to Nuevo Laredo through a network that had killed 7 federal informants. Marcus Webb, her actual handler, had been explicit on their last secure call: blow your cover and you blow the operation. 2 years of work. 3 separate field agents. A cartel network that extends from Texas to the Mexican interior. Katie Morrison, RN, was a cover for Captain Katie Morrison, Defense Intelligence, and if Captain Katie Morrison's actual identity became public knowledge, the entire architecture of surveillance collapsed. So she didn't defend herself. She sat in the disciplinary hearing on Thursday afternoon in an HR conference room where the fluorescent lights buzzed like insects trapped in the ceiling, and she listened to Dr. Mercer present his documentation with the measured professionalism of a man who'd never raised his voice in his life and never needed to. Elena Santos, the chief nursing officer, looked pained. Her hands moved across the stack of reports like she was handling something toxic. Katie, you saved Joseph Kern's life. Every clinician in this hospital knows that. But Dr. Mercer is correct about protocol. Joint Commission is explicit. A nurse performing a procedure that falls under the scope of physician practice creates liability for the hospital. Katie's jaw tightened once. Just once. Then nothing. The composure of someone who'd negotiated with insurgent commanders at gunpoint didn't crack over administrative reprimand. I understand, Katie said. Effective immediately, you're suspended, pending investigation. With pay. We don't know how long this will take, but we'll contact you. The letter came on Tuesday. She read it in her apartment that night, the words accumulating like scar tissue: suspension, investigation, review of scope of practice, potential license review with the State Board of Nursing. The language was bureaucratic, careful, but the message was clear: the gears had turned, the machinery had engaged, and now it was simply a matter of time before she was expelled. She drove to a Denny's on the interstate highway outside San Antonio at 2:19 a.m. because the apartment felt too small, the walls too close, and the folded flag in her locker at Cedar Creek, Marcus Chen's flag, the teammate she'd watched die covering her extraction from Ramadi, was suffocating her from a distance of 12 miles. She ordered coffee and took a booth by the window facing the parking lot, where her truck sat under sodium lights looking like it belonged to someone competent, someone who had their life arranged in a functional order. The coffee came in a chipped ceramic mug. It was hot. She didn't drink it. She just held it between her palms and stared at her reflection in the dark window, a ghost image overlaid against the empty highway beyond. The scar on her neck was visible in this light, the one from the piece of shrapnel that had come 2 inches from her carotid artery in 2009. 17 years and the scars still mapped themselves across her body like topographic lines on military terrain maps. 17 years and she was sitting in a Denny's at 3 a.m. with a cooling cup of coffee, trying to figure out how you lose a mission and a career in the same week, how you fail a teammate twice, once by surviving when he didn't, and again by losing the operation he died to protect. A waitress in her 50s with a name tag that read Marlene appeared beside the booth. "You want me to warm that up for you, hun?" Katie looked at the woman, at the exhaustion in her face, the varicose veins climbing her calves, the way her feet had that particular ache that came from working 12-hour shifts on concrete floors. "I'm fine," Katie said. "Thank you." Marlene didn't push. She just refilled the water glass and moved on, the kind of courtesy that came from understanding that some people were fighting wars inside themselves and didn't need an audience for it. Katie touched the bag beside her on the bench, where Marcus Chen's folded flag was wrapped in tissue paper. She'd been carrying it through for deployments, 2 postings, and now a defense intelligence operation that was collapsing in real time. The flag felt heavier tonight than it ever had, like it was accumulating mass from her failures, absorbing her mistakes the way cloth absorbs blood. The diner hummed around her. The fluorescent lights buzzed their insistent white noise. The coffee grew cold. And Katie Morrison sat in the booth, her reflection staring back from the dark window, counting the ways she'd managed to lose everything by doing the right thing. She had no idea what would walk through the doors in 4 days. No idea that everything was about to invert, that the machinery of bureaucracy she'd been crushed under would turn on the man who'd wielded it, that a massive figure wielding a tire iron and speaking her battlefield call sign would become the catalyst that transformed her from suspended nurse into legend. She sat there holding cold coffee at 3:16 a.m., and that was the moment the story pivoted, not toward vindication, but toward revelation. Toward the moment when everyone learned exactly who'd been walking among them, saving lives with her quiet hands, asking nothing but to be left alone to do the job. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 4 days later, and it changed everything. The screaming started at 2:47 in the afternoon. Not the usual ER chaos, this was something else. This was primal. The waiting room doors exploded inward and the man who came through them was built like a war machine, 6'5", shoulders that required him to turn sideways through the frame, blood soaking through a ripped flannel shirt in patterns that told the story of shrapnel wounds that had never quite healed right. His eyes were wild bright, pupils blown, and the tire iron in his right hand was moving like he'd done this before, like violence was just another language and he spoke it fluently. Security guards scattered. A mother pulled her child behind a magazine rack. The receptionist dove under her desk. The waiting room emptied like someone had pulled a fire alarm, bodies moving in that particular panic that happens when the threat is too large to reason with, when fight or flight doesn't even ask a question, it just says run. Katie heard the Pashto curses before she saw him clearly. Specific curses. Battlefield curses. The kind that came from a throat that had been screaming them through mortar fire and the rotor wash of incoming Chinooks. She was already moving before her brain finished processing what her ears had recognized. Not away. Toward. The tire iron came up as she approached. One smooth movement, like he'd rehearsed it 1,000 times in the dark. Her hands went up immediately, visible, empty, unthreatening. She didn't flinch. She didn't brace. She just kept walking, closing the distance at a pace that was measured and calm, the way you'd approach a wounded animal that had bitten before and might bite again. "Nazir," she said. Not a question. A recognition. His name landing like a key sliding into a lock that had been sealed for 14 years. The tire iron trembled. His breathing came in ragged heaves like his lungs weren't designed to hold air anymore, like every breath was a negotiation with the shrapnel embedded in his spine and the memories embedded in his nervous system. Katie had seen this pattern before, had written it in her own muscle memory and her own survival protocols. This was a man in a dissociative panic state, neurologically trapped between 2 different wars, his present tense threat assessment running on a circuit board that had been wired in Helmand province. She kept her voice low. The same voice that had talked down a Taliban subcommander at a Ramadi checkpoint in 2009, the voice that had negotiated the release of 3 civilian hostages while positioned behind a crumbling cement wall with a bolt-action rifle in her hands. That voice had its own texture. It sounded like someone who had already made peace with not living through the next 15 minutes, and there was something in that tone, that utter absence of self-preservation instinct, that made the human brain respond to it as authority. "I know where you are now," she said. "You're not there. You're here. You're safe here." Nazir al-Rashid had been the commander of the eastern cell that Katie's unit had raided in 2009. She'd been the spotter that night, eyes on the compound through thermal imaging, calling targets to the strike team as they moved room to room. He'd escaped through a rear courtyard that the unit's intelligence officer had missed, and Katie had watched his heat signature disappear into the darkness toward the river. For 14 years, she'd carried that mist like a small weight in her chest, the one that got away. She'd read his file again when she arrived in San Antonio for her cover assignment. Current status, unknown. Possibly deceased. Possibly a refugee in Central America. Possibly a ghost. He was here. He was standing in front of her with a tire iron and a 1,000-yard stare, and his voice came out as a whisper that barely carried through the silence of the evacuated waiting room. Basira Aldabiba. The insightful she-wolf. The call sign his unit had given her after the checkpoint negotiation, after word had circulated through the network that there was a female operative who talked like death hadn't occurred to her yet. He knew her. He knew exactly who she was. "You're alive. So are you." Katie took another step closer. Not aggressive. Just closer. "Drop the tire iron, Nazir. You don't want to do this." His arm lowered like it was operated by a puppeteer who'd lost interest. The tire iron hit the tile floor with a sound like a gunshot. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered. Then he collapsed like someone had switched off his spine, and Katie was already there, catching him before his skull could split itself open against the ground, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her breathing controlled. Security arrived 30 seconds later, but they stopped. There was a Marine in dress blue standing in the waiting room, a recruiter, visiting a patient in pediatrics, medals on his chest suggesting he'd seen enough action to recognize when something larger than the room had just occurred. He was staring at Katie with an expression that suggested his brain was running through classified clearance files like a jukebox searching for a song it almost remembered. "Captain Morrison." The Marine's voice was uncertain, like he was reading the past tense of a woman he'd only ever seen in a briefing book. He had his phone out. His fingers moved across the screen. He was pulling something up. His eyes tracked across the text, and Katie watched the moment recognition became certainty, watched his entire posture shift from curiosity to absolute clarity. He read aloud, "Captain Katie Morrison, United States Special Forces, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Silver Star recipient. Credited with 17 lives saved under fire, Ramadi, Anbar Province, 2009. Classified clearance level." He stopped reading the classified parts, but the damage was done. Every word hung in the waiting room like shrapnel suspended mid-air. Dr. Mercer pushed through the crowd. His face was the color of old paper, his voice pitching toward something that wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite coherent. "This is insane. She's violated protocol, she's practiced medicine without." "Did I stutter, Doctor?" The Marine's voice came out like a tank idling in a garage, low and absolute and not requiring volume to enforce compliance. "Captain Morrison's service record is classified. I suggest you stop talking." But it was the salute that ended it. The man who arrived 7 minutes later, walking through the automatic doors with the bearing of someone accustomed to having authority exist simply because he occupied a room. General Marcus Vance, 2 stars on his collar, in San Antonio for a Joint Chiefs Conference, now present in a hospital waiting room because one classified operative's cover had been compromised by a civilian physician's bureaucratic vendetta. He walked directly to Katie, the entire lobby silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the ventilator's wheeze from somewhere deep in the ER, and he rendered a salute that was textbook perfect, a formal acknowledgement of rank and service, the kind of gesture that crystallizes a room into absolute stillness. "At ease, Captain," the general said quietly. Then he turned toward Mercer, and whatever that look contained was sufficient to drain the remaining color from the physician's face. What happened next came in pieces, because the destruction of Dr. Philip Mercer's career wasn't an explosion, it was a process. Mercer's complaints against Katie had triggered a routine defense intelligence audit of Cedar Creek Medical, standard procedure when any federal operative's cover got compromised. That audit pulled the institutional thread, which meant examining every case Mercer had cited as evidence of Katie's incompetence. The sepsis patient he'd used as an example during grand rounds? Katie's medication suggestion would have accelerated treatment by 4 hours. Mercer's delay had extended the ICU stay and generated a malpractice claim that he'd buried by falsifying documentation to blame the nursing staff. The medication order Katie had corrected? Mercer's original prescription was 100 milligrams instead of 10. His handwriting. His signature. Katie's interference had prevented a fatal overdose that would have generated a federal investigation into that institution's medication safety protocols. Case after case accumulated like snow on a roof that was already straining under the weight. 9 documented instances over 3 years. 4 with pending lawsuits. The hospital's legal team found the gaps in his incident reports, the timestamps that didn't match, the testimony from nursing staff that had been systematically excluded from his formal documentation. The state medical board received the findings. Mercer was summoned to a formal hearing where his own meticulous paper trail, the very bureaucratic weaponry he'd used to dismantle Katie's career, became the evidence of systematic negligence and fraud. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. Cedar Creek Medical terminated him for cause, which voided his malpractice insurance. The pending lawsuits, now without institutional protection, settled for amounts that drained his retirement accounts like a bathtub draining through an open plug. No hospital would hire him. No surgical team would take him. No practice would touch his name. The only employment that would accept his applications was a medical supply distribution company, and he now drove a van delivering bedpans and gauze to the same institutions where he'd once performed complex surgeries, where residents had once stood in awe of his technical precision, before they learned about the hidden handwritten calculations in his margin notes, the correction marks in his dosage calculations, the errors he'd spent decades perfecting the art of attributing to other people. Katie's defense intelligence assignment concluded 2 weeks after the general's appearance. Vincent Cross, the hospital administrator, was arrested in his home on a Tuesday morning by DEA agents, his involvement in the cartel's controlled substance diversion network now airtight through 18 months of Katie's embedded observation and the financial records she'd photographed. The operation was complete. Her cover no longer required maintenance because the objective had been achieved. General Vance arrived with her transfer orders, a new posting, a new mission, her captain's rank officially restored from the administrative shadows where it had been living. Joseph Kern was discharged to a VA residential facility in Austin where his spinal cord injury could receive long-term care. He left a handwritten note at the nurse's station, simple paper, his handwriting careful and deliberate. It read, "Some of us made it home because of you. J.K." Katie didn't read it until after she'd cleaned her locker, after she'd carefully folded the flag from Marcus Chen's funeral and placed it in a canvas bag along with her civilian credentials and her next cover identity. Nazir al-Rashid was transferred to federal custody, his refugee asylum processing now complicated by his previous military affiliation but aided by Katie's personal testimony regarding his current mental health status and the medical treatment he'd received at Cedar Creek. The shrapnel in his spine would be managed by VA orthopedic specialists. His civilian identity would be constructed carefully, protected by the same intelligence apparatus that had once hunted him. Katie walked out of Cedar Creek Medical on a Thursday morning, her scrubs replaced by civilian clothes, jeans and a leather jacket, the kind of outfit designed to be forgettable. She passed the parking lot where the medical supply van was parked, where Dr. Mercer sat behind the wheel with his hands gripping it like it might escape. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes hollow, his entire body compressed into the kind of stillness that comes from having nowhere else to go. Katie didn't brake. She didn't stop. She just kept driving, the folded flag and Joseph Kern's note sitting on the passenger seat beside her as she merged onto IE-10, heading toward whatever came next. The hospital shrank in her rearview mirror, became a white rectangle, then disappeared entirely. Thanks for watching. If you found yourself invested in Katie's story, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. There are heroes walking among us, and sometimes their bravest moments happen when nobody's watching. Leave a comment. Have you ever misjudged someone only to find out you were completely wrong? What would you have done in Katie's position? Hit the like button and we'll see you in the next video.